Hello everyone, Simon Jacobson here for another episode of Meaningful Live. Fighting terrorism. How do we bring peace to this world? Let's begin with the maybe most obvious thing that is often not even discussed. What one person calls a terrorist, another person may call a freedom fighter. So you right away have two different axioms, two different assumptions. How do you begin? That's what we will be addressing, but above all, addressing how to actually deal with it head on in the most practical and prudent way that can help us somewhat get through the thorny elements that have plagued the world from the beginning of time. This program is dedicated by Quinton Williams in loving memory of his partner Marvin Shack. So terrorism. As I said, some people will call a terrorist, other people will call a freedom fighter. Everyone has their subjective perspective on things. So then how can we even begin a conversation when we can't even establish, is it terrorism or not terrorism? If someone were to attack you personally, God forbid, or your family, or your community, and you would take up arms to defend yourself, and in turn, in self-defense, kill someone, would that be called terrorism? No. You're protecting yourself. It's self-defense. So what do we define as terrorism? So let me submit this. We all may have different grievances in our lives. The question is how we deal with them. If you're angry at someone and you go ahead and attack them or in any way hurt or kill them, we would consider that to be unacceptable. Unless it was strict self-defense, as I just mentioned. We have a system of law and order, and you want to report somebody, report them to the law enforcement officials and let them deal with it. Now, of course, the argument can be, well, what happens if I don't have anyone to turn to? I don't trust the police. I don't trust authorities. I don't trust the government. I have no choice but to take the law in my own hands. And yes, that can turn into a lynch mob, or it could turn into something that someone would defend as being the only way to protect ourselves. So you see, it gets very complicated. Well, that's why I would like to submit the following. That terrorism would be the definition that the way we resort to solving a problem is by terrorizing and by hurting others. I'll give an example. I'll give a personal example. After the Holocaust, where 6 million of my people, the Jews, were viciously and brutally killed, at the time they had no real way to protect or defend themselves. They were completely at the mercy of their hosts, so to speak. But afterwards, after the war ended, a few years later, Israel became a state with a very powerful army. Now, the rule in history is usually that if someone hurts you, you come back. It's called vengeance. And some would even consider that to be fair. So now the Israeli army would come and start bombing indiscriminately German cities as retribution, payback for what they had done to our people. Now, no one ever even considered doing anything like that. That would be what I would consider an act of terrorism. Why? They may deserve it. But what gain is there right now by doing that? Are you going to gain back the 6 million people? Is that the way to exact vengeance? Or is the way to exact vengeance, which is what most Jews did, was build their families, build their country? And they'll say their revenge, they'll open up a photo album and say, my revenge is the children, the grandchildren, the families I've built. That doesn't mean we forget, that doesn't mean we forgive. It just means that we've channeled our anger through productive ends. If a grievance, however, is addressed through terror, through killing, wanton killing, especially of innocent people, it's one thing you're going to the criminals that actually did something to you directly, but not their relatives and not their brothers and not their grandchildren. That I would categorize as the world of terror because it has a very different objective. Its objective is not to resolve an issue, it's to just exercise and terrorize those around you, to create a fearful environment. 9/11, most people consider to be an act of terror. Why? And I'm not getting into now whether you're pro-West or you're pro-East or you're pro-Arab Muslim or anti-Arab Muslim. Because what was the benefit of exactly? What was the benefit? What was it revenge for? Even if it was active revenge. And what was the goal? The goal was to basically destabilize and terrorize many innocents. Now you could argue that some in the Western world have exercised all kinds of colonialization and oppression. I'm taking now the case of someone who would argue why the Muslim world or the Arab Muslim world is angry at the West. Even if there are legitimate concerns with that, but is that the approach? To kill people, again, wantonly without any discrimination? The mere fact that the Nazis in power terrorized the Jews, the Gypsies, and others that they considered unwanted was acts of terror. Just because they changed the laws doesn't make it less terrorist. So I think intelligent people could come to some consensus. We may disagree what is right and what is wrong, but we can agree what is the right way to approach and correct a wrong. That there are many other ways to do it than killing people. Now, I want to address this in a different context as well. I've had many long discussions with people of all different walks of life, where some argue, when people are pushed in a corner and they've been oppressed and they've been discriminated against, what can you expect of them? Why? Well, of course they'll break out. Maybe they go too far, but they're very frustrated. And they may do things that, yes, we would say cross some lines, but they can legitimize it. But if that's the case, you have to be across the board, say that with all situations. Anyone that has a grievance can do that. Is there only a minority that has a right to terrorize and a majority does not have a right? Is that what it comes down to? And of course, in our therapeutic Western world, many of us will say, we have to recognize, be sensitive to their pain. Yes, recognize and sensitive to their pain. If somebody was walking around with a knife or a gun and shooting people, and then you find out that this person was seriously abused by parents, by family, by community, by the government, would you also say, we have to be sensitive? First, lock him up. First, take away his weapons before he can hurt others, and then be sensitive to him. There's a distortion of when we do things. You don't send flowers to a murderer. So we're not talking about the grievance. We're not invalidating someone's grievance. We're invalidating their method of alleviating their grievance. That's the key thing to remember. Now, if someone is insane, then of course they need to be locked up because they're not in control of themselves. If someone's in control of themselves, you can say to them, yes, there are many ways to deal with anger. That's why I mentioned before. And I say it proudly, not pulling rank. We didn't go ahead and bomb Berlin cafes in retribution to what they did, for what they did to our people back in World War II. We built. And the same I will say across the board. I'm not discussing here, yes, I'm Jewish, and you could say that I'm biased and I'm prejudiced, but I would say this across the board with anyone. So the approach of being sensitive is fine once the methods are humane methods, but not methods that are driven by terrorizing others or hurting others, and especially innocent people included in that. Now you'll say, 1 second, in times of war, innocent people are killed. Well, in times of war, there's a declaration of war of two enemies or two adversaries. that have, we're not getting into who's right and who's wrong, and it's an unfortunate casualty that innocent people, but to target innocent people, is that an approach? Is that legitimate? Now, I know you can say all the Americans are not innocent, we killed the Indians. All the Americans are not innocent, we enslaved the blacks. But is that correct to say a collective guilt on that level? No, again, we're not dismissing and in any way minimizing any crime that may have been done. And you have to find ways to deal with it. So without suggesting any simple answers, I think it's important to lay out some of these fundamental principles. Let's talk about appeasement, the approach of appeasement. Classic story, of course, is Sir Neville Chamberlain, Prime Minister of Great Britain, travels to Germany, and he feels that he's appeased Hitler. He'll give him the Sudetenland, a part of Switzerland, and that will appease him, and he'll stop right there. He barely gets on the plane back to Great Britain, and Hitler has already moved through Sudetenland to Czechoslovakia into Poland. Churchill famously said, appeasement is feeding the crocodiles in the hope that you'll be eaten last. Another way of putting it is this: when you're compassionate to cruel people, you'll end up being cruel people to compassionate people. You'll end up being cruel to, when you're compassionate to the cruel, you'll be cruel to the compassionate. Let's make it simple. So we all want peace. We all would love appeasement. We all would love to say that's it. But appeasement is only possible if two things happen. That the means, the tools that the other side is using is not ones of terror and nefarious and so on. And number two, they're ready to talk in a real serious way, not duplicitous. The problem when you allow anger to be expressed in ways that are wrong, yes, two wrongs do not make a right, bottom line. And that's what we can expect from decent civil human beings. Now for that you have to be honest, you have to be good intentioned, you have to really want to achieve it. If you just want power and justify it in any ways, then you can justify anything. You won't call it terror, you'll call it, as Hitler called it, Lebensraum. We need more room. Or we need to allow the German populations in certain countries, they want to reunite with us, the Anschluss of Austria, and so on. But that's what people have bad intentions in mind. Let's take it even more personally. I remember sitting with once a group of, we'll call them Palestinians. They lived in New York, and one of them knew me somewhat. And we had a conversation. It was a decent conversation. And they spoke about their grievances in what they call Palestine, how their homes and their vineyards and their olive fields were stolen by the Israelis, that they're occupied, and so on. So I say, okay, so what do you think is the solution? That we will continue to attack and kill until we get what we want. But I say, but many of the people living in Israel never did anything wrong to anyone. Men, women, and children. So why are they guilty? And let's put it the other way around. If you attack their homes of innocent people, so imagine somebody here living in the United States, and your neighbor says to you, hey, the home you live in really belonged to my grandparents. And unless you give me your living room, I'm not going to let you be at peace. I will attack you. I'll burn your house down. I'll attack your children. What would you do? You would do everything possible to protect yourself, because that's called terrorism. You have a legal claim on my home, so take it to court. Okay, well, one of them said, well, the courts in Israel are controlled by the Israelis. Okay, well, you have to deal with the realities on the ground. You may have a claim, maybe you don't have a claim, who knows? But you can't begin with a premise of saying, I will do whatever I can do, and with no laws, with no rules. Because then you don't have the decency that human beings need to have to be able to live with each other. And especially when you throw in religious conviction. So then it's a jihad. It's a holy war. And then there's no recourse altogether. It's God is doing this. You've desecrated my God. But as the God, that same God says in the Bible and in the Quran and other holy books, holy, considered holy by different religions, that there are ways to deal with things. That same God said, I created all human beings. Abraham, who everybody considers the first prophet, was a man of peace. He prayed for infidels. So to make it a religious battle, the way we fight religious battles is not through war. Pray for them. Protect them. Show compassion. Show empathy. Now, I know some of you may consider what I'm saying as being somewhat naive. You think you're just going to say a few words, a few nice, noble words, and everything's going to be resolved. Well, my hope is to reach people who are thinking somewhat and are not allow themselves to be caught up in the biases and prejudices of the past, because that's the only people you can really speak to. Those that have already preconceived notions, that have already made up their minds one way or the other, forget about it. If someone doesn't even think it's called terrorism, obviously I'm not going to convince them otherwise. So my friends, there is a way to bring world peace. If enough of us establish standards, that doesn't mean we have to agree about everything, but standards. Standards that define what's acceptable behavior, what's not acceptable behavior. What's acceptable way of airing your complaints, your grievances, and what's not an acceptable way. Enough of us stand up with that and don't buckle to any pressure, we will have a better world. That I'm convinced of. Will everyone join? You can't control everybody. You can control yourself, you can control those around you. So I wanted to open the conversation up in that sense of realizing we're not talking about labeling anybody as good and evil. We're not talking about one person is completely right, completely wrong. The question is how to deal with it. Simply unacceptable that if you disagree with someone or you have a grievance, that you can do something what we consider and call terrorism. And you fight it by standing not weak and just appeasing and giving in. On the other hand, you don't fight violence with violence unless it's self-defense. You stand with strength. Because weakness is the worst possible thing when you're dealing with someone who's terrorizing you. Because then they feel that they're winning and they'll terrorize you even further to get more. So it's about having strength and strength of conviction. Acknowledging, I have no problem, I want to hear what you have to say. But not as an excuse. I want to hear it in a sincere way. I want to address that there are many ways to resolve an issue, or at least to agree to disagree. And just rule out the concept of killing someone that's innocent, of terrorizing someone that's innocent, and maiming or hurting anyone that's innocent. And even those that are guilty, we don't take the law in our own hands. Again, self-defense is a very different story, direct self-defense. Someone declared war on you, you have to mobilize and be ready anytime because they've already declared war. It's not a neutral situation. That is why there are many who are not hawks or necessarily right-wing will say, you want peace in the world? You need to be strong. You negotiate with strength, not weakness. You don't appease, you don't compromise, you don't give up. You want true peace? Talk to me like a peaceful person, and I'll reciprocate. If there's no trust, obviously you'll have issues. That's why we have to begin with those of us that do have some trust in each other, or trust at least in some civil standards. So a lot of what I've said I think is plain common sense, nothing very brilliant. But sometimes common sense is not so common. We need to step back, clear the air. I have no question, no doubt, if we isolate those that want to be fanatic, those that want to be, label them terrorists, that's them. But the more we isolate them, the more we don't buy into it, by either minimizing it or ignoring it or denying it or appeasing, the stronger the world will become, a world seeking true peace. Remember, diversity is not the issue. It's when diversity turns into to divisiveness, which turns into conflict and discord and war. And then deep-seated anger and distrust, and finding ways that legitimizing illegitimate methods to alleviate that grievance. That's where the problems begin. So hopefully I can appeal to those of you that have a similar way of thinking. We may not agree politically, we may not agree with all kinds of different conclusions, but we can agree with the methods to be used. I'm a firm believer that the human being, each of us, is fundamentally a good person. But we also have weeds, and we have rough edges. And we also have another voice that can become very, very selfish, and very angry, and very vindictive. But at the same time, we have to be wise people who have self-control over ourselves, and can have these conversations, as I said, in a decent and civil way. And finally, I want to say something on a very personal note. I don't know if you and I can come up with a global terrorist solution to fighting terrorism, but we can fight it in our own hearts and souls, in our own homes, in our own environments. Remember the rule, microcosm, macrocosm. Everything in the macrocosmic larger world exists within you in a microcosm. We all have that little devil within us, the little terrorist within us, that sometimes comes out. It doesn't necessarily mean it's destructive, quite like in the case of killing someone, but we can insult people. We can be cynical. Other ways that we hurt one another. If we can eliminate and abolish within our own hearts and souls those darker places, whether it's just vengeance or whether it's jealousy or just plain schadenfreude, we just can't stand someone else being successful for whatever reason, or it's our own insecurities. Those areas within our own lives, the darker parts, the darker voices, if we can mitigate it, somewhat quiet it down, lower the temperature, that has a butterfly effect on the world around us. So it doesn't matter whether you have political connections and whether you can have direct influence in the Middle East or other parts of the world where people are terrorizing each other, whether it's tribal battles in Africa, or whether it's Russia and Ukraine, or other similar scenarios. It comes down to, in each of our own personal lives, correct something, a little lower your aggression, lower your anger, your violence. When I say violence, I mean even feelings of that. And in effect, it does have the ripple effect that will impact the world around us. Because as Maimonides writes, after all, always see the world like a scale, equal scale, with merits and vices equally balanced. And when you add one good thought, one good word, one good action, you tip the scale and bring personal and global redemption. That's the power we have. And science today corroborates the concept through butterfly effect, ripple effect. So at the end of the day, it really comes down to that each of us in our own homes, how we talk to our children, how we make sure that they talk about each other, always with an extra measure of kindness, not with that critique, that biting element. That may be innocuous, but ultimately can grow and become amplified and being much worse than just a little dissent. The more we bring that type of love into our conversations, into our dialogues, the more the world changes. And look, we also have to be honest. The fact of the matter is, with all our challenges, the world is a far more benevolent place than ever. I remember a few years ago in Haiti, it was an earthquake. So instead of raping and pillaging a vulnerable, defenseless country, which was always happened in the past, countries all over the world were competing to bring aid, food, medicine, support to this helpless and defenseless country. So there's an element of charity and kindness that has entered into our atmosphere. Charity is rewarded. The United States of America, for all its strengths and weaknesses, does give out billions of dollars of aid to other countries. Why aren't the hard tax paying dollars of the citizens of this country complaining? Because there is a climate of benevolence, of kindness. What we have to do is make sure that it fills the entire world, not just parts of it, and not just in spurts, but becomes the standard. The standard that we are blessed with life and that we're all part of one larger organism. And if one organism is hurting, all of us are hurting. That's the ultimate message we need to tell every person. You think when you terrorize, you hurt someone else, you're just hurting them, you're hurting yourself. You just don't feel it. So imagine turning on our own. So yes, we may have disagreements, we have strong disagreements. You may have many big, deep grievances. But at the end of the day, killing one part of your body is killing also the rest of the body. May we be blessed with this awareness, and this deeper insight and understanding that we're all just like subatomic particles of one larger reality, that we're all pieces of one greater symphony, that we all play our unique music, diverse, but at the same time complementary, and create true harmony within diversity. A world of true peace, filled with divine knowledge as the waters cover the sea. And when you have that divine knowledge, the prophet tells us there will be no longer evil and destruction. Why? Because divine knowledge is not just knowledge. It's humble knowledge. It's the knowledge of the purpose of our lives. At the end of the day, if we could just engage in a conversation, what is the purpose of our lives? And realize that we're all seeking that purpose and that we all need each other, that too. And again, may sound naive to some, but we are dreamers and we believe. And the world has become better. And I have no doubt it will become even better. Thank you. This has been Simon Jacobson. I appreciate you listening. I'd love to hear your feedback, your thoughts, your comments, your critique. I'd love to hear from those, the more, let's call it sarcastic, cynical ones who may dismiss some of these idealistic dreams. But please, I'd love for you to share any of your thoughts. And please share with others. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're here every Sunday in this program, among many programs that we produce every week. This one is at 3 o'clock New York Eastern Time. I'm both on YouTube, on Facebook, and all our platforms. And please check us out at meaningfullife.com. Simon Jacobson. And again, I'd love to hear from you, and please share. May we in our lifetime experience true world peace, personally, collectively, and globally. Be well.